Iron Maiden did not become the band we know today overnight. There was a very specific moment when the band stood right on the edge between being just another promising new wave of British heavy metal act and becoming one of the biggest metal bands in history. And that moment did happen during the Killers World Tour.
You said it, Killers!
So today, let's take a look at the real reason why Iron Maiden actually decided to switch vocalists back in 1981, and then talk about whether Steve Harris was actually right in his judgment. Here you go. Back in early 1981, following the release of their second studio album Killers, Iron Maiden embarked on what would eventually become their first truly global, worldwide breakthrough tour, the Killers World Tour. And this was not just another run of shows. This was the moment where Iron Maiden stepped outside the UK scene and proved that they could survive and dominate on an international level, touring extensively across Europe, Japan, and North America, both with headline concerts and as a supporting act to such bands as UFO and Judas Priest. Yeah. They did once again open for Judas Priest back in 1981, which even today, 45 years later, is a dream come true of a bill for all of the die-hard heavy metal fans like myself. Setlist-wise, this was still a very much early Iron Maiden. The band played material from the first two albums almost in its entirety, with the bare exception of Charlotte the Harlot, and moving from clubs into much larger venues, including iconic stages like Hammersmith Odeon in London, and a very unique moment for Iron Maiden and for heavy metal that came on September 6th, 1981, when Iron Maiden performed in Belgrade, Yugoslavia, becoming one of the first heavy metal acts to give a concert behind the Iron Curtain. For the first time. And believe me, a person who was actually born on the other side of the Iron Curtain, this was a huge deal, both for the band themselves and of course for thousands of heavy metal maniacs who got to witness their first ever heavy metal gig that night. And so, yes, 1981 was a huge year for Iron Maiden. It was possibly the first real breakthrough year for this band. But at the same time, while everything on the outside looked like a band on the rise, internally the situation was becoming much more complicated. Because during this very tour, the cracks inside Iron Maiden were becoming pretty much impossible to ignore anymore. By the way guys, if you would like to support my efforts of releasing Iron Maiden related videos amidst all the craziness of being right here in Ukraine and rock one of the Metal Pilgrim merch designs, like for example this one, No Fear of the Dark, or the Up the Pilgrims one at the upcoming Run For Your Lives tour, I'll be more than happy to send it pretty much anywhere across the world. And you can of course order it via a link in the description in this video. And thank you guys for all your support. Pretty much every Iron Maiden fan knows about the crazy side of Iron Maiden's legendary frontman Paul Di'Anno, and all the problems that came with it. And of course those problems did not suddenly appear during the Killers World Tour. They've been building up for some time. Even in the late 1970s, when Rod Smallwood first became involved with the band, there were already concerns about Paul's reliability and behavior. There are stories from that era about missed rehearsals and unpredictable situations, and while some of them were exaggerated over time, still, the underlying issue was rather real. Consistency.
Even Paul, who makes out to be very loud and obnoxious, isn't at all. He's a sweetheart, really. Sorry to ruin your image, Paul.
But at the same time, I would actually argue that Paul Di'Anno was exactly whom Iron Maiden needed in the early days. And even more, he was actually precisely because of whom Iron Maiden became the band we know today, as it was his punk rock craziness that helped Iron Maiden stand out from the rest of the new wave of British heavy metal bands. And no matter what anyone says, Iron Maiden benefited greatly from his madness in the early days, even if Steve Harris himself would occasionally have to step in to the role of a vocalist. And at the same time, if we're being very honest, Paul Di'Anno's madness of the early days was by far not the only issue in Iron Maiden back in 1981. And behind the scenes, there were actually some rather teutonic fundamental changes going on in the band. Although, of course, the pressure of the Killers World Tour did have its toll on all of the band members. This was no longer a few UK gigs. This was a demanding international schedule with constant travel, tight commitments, and very little room for mistakes. And as we all know, that life is not for everyone, as we will see once again in Iron Maiden's history in just a couple of years. But back in 1981, Paul himself later admitted that lifestyle simply did not suit him, and he openly said that he did not believe he could last through that kind of a tour, and the first practical consequences of that insecurity started showing pretty early in the run, with several shows in Germany having to be cancelled so he could rest his voice, which of course was a serious issue for a band that was trying to establish itself professionally. And on top of all that, there were actually some pretty serious creative tensions going on between Paul and the rest of the boys in Iron Maiden. Exactly the same tensions that at first were actually the locomotive that drove Iron Maiden forward, and the ones that separated them from the rest of the new wave of British heavy metal scene of that time. But back in 1981, when they were already trying to be an established act, started turning into problems for Iron Maiden. As Paul recalled, after Killers was released, he started to lose interest in the musical direction the band was tending towards. And more specifically, with Iron Maiden becoming more technical, more structured, and further away from that raw punk-influenced edge that he personally identified with. As just a reminder, he always called himself a punk rock singer, and never a metal singer.
I'm just a soul whose intentions are good. Oh Lord, please don't let me be misunderstood.
And on top of all that, there was of course a rather infamous songwriting situation. As just a reminder, on the debut album, Paul had co-writing credits on Running Free, Remember Tomorrow, and Sanctuary, when on Killers his contribution was much more limited, with only Killers itself being credited to him alongside Steve Harris. Although according to Paul Di'Anno, he actually wrote a bunch of songs, all of which were simply rejected by Steve Harris. And that imbalance became the real source of frustration and quite a lot of arguments within the band. With Paul being Paul, of course, being rather vocal about his feelings back in the day. And of course, on top of all of that, there was a much more significant issue. Substantial substance abuse. Paul himself has been very open about this in later years, admitting that his drug use escalated during that period and made him increasingly unreliable. And as Steve Harris later on explained, he felt that Paul simply did not believe in himself enough to take the band to the next level, resulting in them eventually deciding to make a switch and change their vocalists back in 1981. But at the same time, if we're being very honest, I don't actually think that Paul Di'Anno was the problem there. And the most important reason why Iron Maiden simply had to change their vocalist was not his madness, not the substance abuse, and not the creative differences. Although all of those, of course, added quite a lot to the decision, but rather a fundamental understanding of musical processes and a long-term vision for Iron Maiden that was masterfully predicted by Steve Harris and Rod Smallwood years before it would actually be needed. By late 1981, Iron Maiden had already started looking ahead. After seeing Bruce Dickinson perform with Samson at the Reading Festival, Rod Smallwood brought him to the band's attention, and auditions followed shortly after. And hey, I actually did a special episode on Bruce Dickinson's auditions in Iron Maiden, so I'm not gonna go into the details of it in this particular episode. You can just watch that episode later. But that's exactly where the things started getting interesting. As even before Bruce officially joined, Iron Maiden were already testing material that would define their next era. During the later stages of the Killers World Tour, the band began performing early versions of songs that would appear on The Number of the Beast, including Children of the Damned, 22 Acacia Avenue, The Prisoner, and eventually Run to the Hills. And that tells you everything you need to know. The band was already evolving musically, moving forward a more melodic, dramatic, and technically ambitious sound. And even more, that's the direction he simply could not do, both vocally and physically. And so the change of a vocalist for Iron Maiden was not about behavior, it was about the band's direction. But the craziest thing is that all of that happened in 1981. Right at the rise of the new wave of British heavy metal scene, when exactly that mix of punk rock and heavy metal was the thing that was selling the best. And Iron Maiden were already on top of it, but at the same time, instead of doubling down on what they were already some of the best in the world at, right then, in 1981, they started to make a switch in their stylistic direction. The switch, which would first show on the Number of the Beast, and would be eventually completed on Peace of Mind. And it is exactly that switch, or rather its timing, that eventually would make Iron Maiden one of the biggest heavy metal bands on the planet. In 1981, when punk rock aggression and heavy metal was selling like crazy, Steve Harris and Rod Smallwood were somehow already able to predict the stylistic shift heavy metal would have to take in the next 5 to 7 years if it wanted to survive. And this time around, they decided to be one of the very first bands on this planet to act on, which eventually would allow them to rather quickly transform Iron Maiden from an underground force and the rising stars of new wave of British heavy metal to the avant-garde force of this genre all around the world. And none of this would be possible without a rather drastic shift in musical composition, which simply required a change in vocals, and which would eventually completely separate them from the rest of the new wave of British heavy metal scene. As the truth is that none of the bands that grew up together with Iron Maiden would eventually be able to reach the heights Iron Maiden did in the next several years. As from that point on, all of them were simply going with the flow, when Iron Maiden themselves suddenly transitioned to a premier league of this genre. So yes, although of course Paul Di'Anno's craziness was a rather important argument in the band deciding to make a final decision, I actually think that if needed, Steve Harris and Rod Smallwood would have found a way to make Paul more responsible if they needed to. But instead, after 1981, they decided to take this band in a completely different direction. And as crazy as that band might have looked like back in 1981, it was the right one. And it would eventually be the one that would make this band one of the biggest heavy metal bands to ever walk this earth. But anyways, what do you guys personally think about the Iron Maiden stylistical change? And do you think the change in vocalists was simply necessary back in 1981? Please let us know in the comments. As always, thank you so much for watching this video, guys, and we will prevail. Slava Ukraini!